Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar, Empowerment and Fraud Prevention are Key. How to improve the consumer experience, build trust, and reduce risk. My name is Joe Talbot, and I'll be your moderator today. I lead our sales and client success for Experian Partner Solutions. I'm very excited to share a lot of insights with you all today. Before we get into it, I want to just cover off on three real quick things. So first, the presentation will be recorded. So at the end of the session, it'll be available on demand. Second, if you're having any technical difficulties, try to refresh your browser or pop into the chat box exactly what's happening, and one of our experts will connect with you offline. And then thirdly, we want to make sure this is a valuable session. So as you're hearing the content, please, if you have any questions, pop them into the chat box so we can address those during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, let's get started. Let me introduce our esteemed panelists and speakers for the day. So we have first our very own Brian Staff. He is the VP of Engineering and Dark Web Intelligence. He has 20 years of startup and enterprise experience. He's now been with Experian leading our product development teams over the last 12 years. And what Brian does is he leads a team of our analysts, our data scientists, and our engineers, really with an aim to bring solutions and capabilities to consumers that help educate and protect them. I mean, what a mission that is, Brian. So super excited to have you today. Also, Brian's the third-time winner of the Inventor of the Year at Experian North America. So welcome.
Thanks, Joe.
So you'll also hear from Tracy Kitten today. She's the Director of Fraud and Security at Javelin Strategy and Research. She's recognized in financial services and cybersecurity as a subject matter expert. She's a journalist with over 18 years of experience covering fraud, payments, financial technology, and cybersecurity. She's interviewed countless of industry experts, practitioners, and even some hackers. And I mean, Tracy, I'd love to hear more about that over coffee or a glass of wine.
Definitely.
At Javelin, she helps the practice and its clients grow and strengthen their resiliency. So welcome both, super excited for the session today. So let's get started, shall we? So today we're going to talk about the opportunity. Recently Experian sponsored a research study with Javelin called Giving Consumers Control and Enhancing Fraud Prevention. So today we're going to talk about, what companies need to do as you respond to the consumer shift towards digital channels with enhanced fraud controls that can really improve the consumer experience, build trust, and reduce risk. I mean, simply put, when consumers are empowered and they're engaged, businesses improve and everybody wins. As you hear the topic for today, if you want to dig deeper, at the end of the session, you're going to get an email from us where you can download the white paper. But our plan is to cover those strategic insights and also how to turn those insights into action. And we're going to start with really what is the current landscape today. And I think, Brian, I'd like to turn it over to you to get us started in that conversation.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so COVID-19 really changed a lot of things for a lot of people, not only just our work life, but also kind of our life behaviors. And the more usage you have with digital devices, and this could be cell phones, personal laptops, work devices, the more control you're going to need. And you need to be able to be more location agnostic, we found, over the last 18 months in order to get your job done, whatever job that may be. But with that comes a lot of increased risks. And there's a lot that institutions and brands can do, especially around fraud prevention in this area to protect their employees and consumers. And this can be everything from different authentication options to physical biometrics to one-time passcodes to things like multi-factor authentication, or even what's very popular now you may hear of instead of MFA is 2SV, which is basically just two-step verification. So there's a lot of things that can be done out there. There's a lot of great information on this one slide, but I want to point you to a few parts. So over in the upper right, you can see all age groups are using mobile banking, right? And so whether you be 55 plus, it's more than 50%, 18 to 34 is 94%. So in terms of one of the riskiest things you can ever do online is obviously things related to your mobile banking or anything related to any type of financial transaction. The other point I'm going to look over, if we look to the far left, we see the one graph going from 68 to 78%. And so that is use of mobile wallets, whether it be Apple Pay, Android Pay, basically anything where you're making a purchase in a physical store through your mobile device. And so that has shown a dramatic increase over the last few years. And a lot of this is very much driven by COVID-19 and just the general trends toward more mobile usage that we have seen. The bottom line is consumers want more of an active control and role in preventing fraud. And that is the trend that we're going to continue to talk about today and that you should really need to be aware of. So security is a priority and people are becoming more privacy aware. And this is due to one big factor, which is that, it's public knowledge that a lot of your data is out there because of the volume of breaches that have occurred. Now, with the volume of breaches that have occurred, especially over the last 5 years, that has been accompanied with major fraud. My one concern is, and this is something I think everyone on the call and on this who eventually views this webinar needs to be aware of, is I think there is a fair amount of breach fatigue that has set in among employees and consumers. And so we need to find a way to counterbalance that fatigue with very relevant and very focused information. So a lot of this is due to increased use of social media and remote work platforms that have really exploded due to COVID-19 and people working more remote. One specific stat that has been made publicly available is RDP, which is Remote Desktop Protocol, which is what most people often use to remotely log in, especially if you're a small or medium-sized business. They don't have as many security procedures in place. It was a 700% increase in attacks on that particular protocol during the first year of the pandemic. So, we have kind of a saying within the cyber team and within my dark web analysts and engineers is, we like to view ourselves as fishermen and we like to go where there's fish, which is basically where there's fraud and data. Well, the threat actors think the same way. They go where the people are, right, and where those transactions are being performed. And so when we had this huge shift from working in more secure corporate facilities to everyone mostly working remote, that is where the hackers really moved their shift. Now, Cyber Agent is one of the tools that is available that can really be a way to counteract a lot of this fraud. And it's in two ways. One is just the volume of data that we have. The second is the variety of data that we have. And so obviously the volume of data is important. We have a little over 17 billion records, dark web records. These can be social security numbers, passports, driver's license, credit card information. We've sent out over 150 billion alerts to consumers who have signed up for this product over the last 12 months. The other piece is variety. So it's not about a single attribute or just monitoring your credit or monitoring one specific piece of your identity. It's really looking at your entire digital footprint. And so we monitor about a dozen or so elements. Basically, anything that could be monetized on the dark web, we try to get access to, grab that data so we can properly alert consumers to that type of threat. Turn it over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Brian, for that. Tracy, I think you were going to really get into what consumers are saying about the data collection and adopting new technologies. So love to hear your point of view on that.
Yeah, great. So thanks for handing that over, Joe, and thanks, Brian. One thing I'll just want to kind of piggyback on that Joe shared is that when we think about data, there's a lot of data that is meaningful to attackers, right? So it's not just financial data or social security numbers anymore. They can take all types of data and create a profile. And so it's everything from email addresses and passwords to things like credit card numbers. So data collection, is something that consumers are very sensitive about. And we know that consumers don't like to have their data tracked. They don't like to have their behaviors tracked. But what we have found is that if they understand how data tracking can help to improve security, can help to prevent fraud, then they're definitely more willing to have their behaviors and their data tracked. So you can see here this stat, 60% of US consumers say that they are uncomfortable with having what we call personally identifiable information and images of themselves from mobile devices and social media collected. But on the other hand, we see that nearly half, 45%, say that they're actually okay with device and location monitoring if they know that it prevents fraud. So as long as consumers clearly understand these benefits of tracking, and that would include personal information, data use behaviors, their comfort with and their interest in such tracking really dramatically improves. The issue is, though, financial institutions can't just take that and run with it. Consumers, don't want to give all companies just a blank check per se. So increased cyber awareness of cyber risk, can really be a double-edged sword, right? So as Brian mentioned, we saw this, rapid transition to digital transactions. Criminals adopted that and jumped on board right away, but consumers also became more cyber aware. So they understand that they need to have heightened protections. They want those heightened protections. It's actually an expectation that they have. They don't want their personal information tracked because they know that could put them possibly at greater risk. So, the onus now is kind of on financial services to show what's being tracked and why it's being tracked and how it's being used to enhance security. So in closing, I just kind of say the message, here for financial institutions is pretty clear. Consumers and financial institutions, will benefit if the expectations are clearly laid out in the beginning, and fraud obviously is reduced. And then plus, if you give consumers a little bit more control over what's being tracked and why, and you actually engage them and involve them in fraud detection and fraud prevention, they're actually more likely to buy in, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. We call it consumer empowerment, empowering them to play an active role in fraud detection and prevention. So we can see here on this slide that it's no secret that financial institutions are the ones that get blamed when fraud occurs, right? So even if the fraud is not the financial institution's responsibility, we've seen this a lot with the so-called scams that we've seen emerging in the wake of the pandemic. Scams, of course, are nothing new, but they did surge during the pandemic and will not go away. And the way we define a scam is, something that triggers a consumer to take some kind of action or response. So ultimately, it's not a failure on the financial institution's part that fraud results. It's because the consumer knowingly took some kind of action that resulted in fraud. However, that said, even if the consumer is responsible, they're likely to blame the financial institution if they suffer some kind of loss. And in the end, the financial institution is the one that suffers because they will likely lose that consumer. Or the consumer will, not do as much business with that financial institution going forward. So we can see here that in 2020, 38% of consumers said they closed a bank account that was adversely affected by fraud, and 69% said that they didn't get fraud resolution from their primary financial institution, and that's rather concerning. I think financial institutions really need, especially as we see, more fintech providers emerging. We see social media platforms becoming more competitive in the financial services space. The landscape is not the way it used to be, right? There's no guarantee that the customers you have today are going to be your customers and members tomorrow, especially among the younger generations like millennials, as an example. So I think this is really important for financial institutions to get ahead of this, to focus on the empowerment, but also the partnership with their customer and member base because you want to help them resolve that fraud. So, the two main reasons that a consumer is going to change the way they interact with or do business with a financial institution, of course, number one is fraud. So we want to get fraud, out of the picture as much as possible, although we know fraud is still going to occur, right? So, what can we do to help the consumer, resolve that fraud? The number two reason is most likely because the consumer perceives that there's some kind of, security shortcoming. So if you have a security incident, even if it's not necessarily a data breach, even if no information was stolen or lost, the consumer is likely to leave your institution because they perceive you to be less secure. So, those two stats alone, in my mind, support why it's so important to empower consumers to play active roles in fraud detection and prevention. And the key takeaways here, I think, are pretty clear. Again, you want to prevent fraud in the first place, but you also want to empower consumers by providing them with some fraud prevention tools that will help improve that customer and member experience, and also in the long run reduce attrition.
I mean, Tracy, it's a great point, and what we continuously hear is that consumers expect it from the brands that they engage with the most, right? These are table stakes. You guys provided a lot of great, valuable insights. So thanks, Brian and Stacey and Tracy, for that. Now I think about, what do we do with all these insights? How do we turn these insights into action to create opportunities for the consumers out there? And these opportunities really have to align with the digital focus, right? So love to hear, maybe starting with you, Brian, on some of the recommendations that you see in the marketplace.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Joe. I mean, this is actually one of my favorite slides on this deck, and I think it's very instructive to financial institutions or really anyone who's listening to this webinar and wants to take a more proactive role moving forward to empower consumers. Being that consumers are the most vulnerable to fraud in the space, they don't have like I have an engineering director to handle firewalls and patches and all the latest security concerns, right? Like even a small business, they don't have that infrastructure and that human intelligence surrounding them to protect them 24/7, 365. I think you'll notice, obviously 59% of consumers, so about 6 in 10 of consumers are very comfortable with having their devices and location tracked if it does help prevent fraud. And if you look at the right part of the graph here, right, you see in terms of fraud prevention, unauthorized access, most people are comfortable with that. It starts to take a pretty big dip once you start getting to, well, we're going to use your banking information, not just your device information, to prevent fraud, right? So I think that starts to get people questioning, well, why do you need my bank information? And then you see a rapid drop off when really you go outside what I would call probably clear transparency and narrow focus that's about protecting them directly, protecting their accounts, their devices, their interaction with you in order for them to do their job, whatever that job is, whether it's to open a bank account or to pay their rent, or if you're not in the financial space, maybe it's to rent a movie, right? There's a real hard drop off. And so I just want to repeat that again. If you're transparent and you keep a narrow focus and educate the consumer that you're trying to empower them, you're trying to help them take responsibility, and this is really about protecting their transactions rather than potentially just the marketing of their information for a discount, which benefits them, but ultimately that is not where most people are at. So I think you really need to make sure that message gets across as you roll out any type of new feature or policy or procedures for your consumers or your employees. There's also a very direct connection between the dark web, personal information, and fraud. And this is something that I also would recommend packaging with any of your features or education as you potentially roll out a new process or product. 5 years ago, most people, when I was being interviewed, whether it be through the media or through clients, was like, is the dark web real, right? Is it real? or it was, is it really that dangerous? Like, what does it really matter? There seems to be a lot of breaches here. What makes one different than the other? I think due to pop culture that most people have a general sense of what the dark web is, but just to reemphasize, it is real. It is something that cannot be shut down, which is often a big question that I get. Well, why can't we, the government just shut it down and this is no longer a problem, right? So it's important to get across that this is real, it's growing, it continues to be a problem. There's various reasons for that, whether it be to organized crime really creating a true business around the dark web, and they built a lot of tools and automation that makes it a lot easier to send out ransomware attacks, for example. There's also jurisdictional concerns, which is why the dark web just can't be shut down. If a server is somewhere, in the far reaches of Europe, it's, the FBI really is not going to be able to do much with that. But at the end of the day, the dark web is a big resale market of personal information. And there's obviously a lot of the other stuff that we don't deal with specifically within my team in terms of the guns and drugs and stuff like that. But there is billions and billions, tens of billions of records of personal information that is out there. And it's not, and we've done a few studies on this, it's not just about the most relevant breach that's an issue, is often just like any good asset, organized crime and others try to figure out a way to remonetize even old data. So that's why it's really important to understand not just, where is my current state of my, digital footprint on the dark web, but where have I been? Am I reusing passwords from 3 years ago? It's like, wow, it's 3 years old. It's not a big deal. That's a big deal because the criminal still has that information and they're going to still reuse that in a lot of their automation attacks moving forward. So just want to leave it at that and we can move on to the next slide. And I think turn it over to Tracy.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And one thing I'll just add to that, I had to kind of laugh internally when you said, 5 years ago, people still kind of question whether or not the dark web was even real, right? But again, going back to the fact that everyone's much more aware, cyber aware, I don't think anyone questions that the dark web exists, although they may question what information is valuable there. So I do think that's where we need to circle back and educate consumers that it's not just social security numbers you need to be concerned about. In fact, I'm less concerned about my social security number already out there anyway, right? It's, some other things that I might not necessarily think about, my images from social media, or again, different email addresses and things that I have that I probably would want to be more mindful of. So yeah, just a couple of things here on the empowerment piece that we've been talking about. And at Javelin, this is something that we're really pushing right now. And, we like to call it empowerment because it really is empowering the consumer to play an active role in preventing fraud. So, one of the challenges that we see is that, I'll circle back to the scams, consumers really need to be educated about what to look for in a scam, because if they understand the triggers, it will be much easier for them to identify it. I mean, we all know that one of the main things that criminals use, one of the tactics they use in any kind of scam, really, and you see this sometime in phishing attacks as well, especially the business email compromise attacks, is there's always this sense of urgency. So the criminal is really trying to push the consumer to take some kind of action very quickly, which obviously, kind of prevents them from, thinking about things clearly, right? So I think if we can educate consumers about what to look for in a scam, some of the emerging scams that we're seeing out there, and some of the tactics, psychological tactics that are used, it really does empower them to maybe just take a step back and say, hey, hang on a second, let me think about this before I take an action, right? Like, think before we click. But it's also equally important to provide consumers with the right types of tools that will help them work with their financial institutions and other businesses to help detect suspicious activity when they see it, right? So some of the examples here would be text alerts, email alerts, voice notifications, anything that might raise a flag to the consumer that something is fishy, right? So if their account balance falls below a certain amount, and they haven't used that account in a while, that would raise a flag. A purchase perhaps that they didn't make, if they get an alert, that would raise a flag. I think the key to alerts is that they need to happen in pretty much real time, or as close to real time as they can. Now, when it comes to account balances, I would recommend that those happen, relatively often. I used to see financial institutions allowing consumers to set those up for like once a week. I think we should dissuade consumers, and maybe not even offer that option because it needs to happen on a fairly regular basis. But again, it just goes back to kind of having this collaboration and working in tandem with the consumer to empower them to play this more active role. And I think that also, helps the consumer understand their accountability, right? In fraud prevention, and how, we really as an industry should go back to them and explain, we all want to prevent fraud, and the more you're empowered and the more active role you play as a consumer, the better you will help us to help detect fraud and, and prevent it in the first place. So, what we're suggesting here is that you empower consumers with what we call a security hub. I mean, you could really call it anything you want to, but it would basically be a place where the consumer could go, could set up transaction limits, could set up, notifying the financial institution when they're going to be traveling. They could manage their mobile banking apps. They could monitor their credit. They could do all types of things in this kind of secure hub. And then of course, the other, piece of this beyond empowerment is that it really helps, with the fraud resolution and response, right? If we have the consumer playing a part there. So we can go to the next slide, please, Joe. And Brian, I apologize. I should have asked if you had any additional thoughts there on empowerment before we move forward.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, two quick thoughts is, whatever you're strongest in, you don't have to do all of these. If you're in a specific business where you could potentially do all of these things for your consumers, great. But if you're really good at travel, maybe you're in the travel space, well, obviously travel notifications is your sweet spot. So make them really good, really informative, and really clear. And then the second thing is just around, you often hear like, well, make sure you're secure and you're using the right encryption. Make sure all your data is encrypted. The hacking community, like I said, and overall organized crime, the nation states have gotten very good at decrypting encrypted information. So it's not just about encryption, it's about the right encryption. So things like, encryption that's 256-bit, which basically means 2 to the power of 256 combinations of potential keys that get created. So we're seeing, my team that is, has seen more and more of lower level encryption services. Things are encrypted with 128-bit being decrypted more and posted on the dark web, that information. So making sure you're using the highest level of modern day encryption possible is also very, very important.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. Okay, so, I think the main message here for institutions is you want to have a playbook. I mean, I'll call it a playbook. You could call it whatever you want to, that really looks at fraud resolution and breach response. A well-developed fraud resolution plan and breach response plan that's in place before you have fraud or before you have a breach can go a long way to have a positive impact, right? And a good plan, I would think, should include how you're going to work with consumers when fraud does occur, right? It should also maybe fall under the purview of an existing disaster recovery and business continuity plan, which many companies, by and large, had to quickly revamp during the height of the pandemic, right? Because everyone had to quickly start working remotely and they really didn't have anything to turn to but their business continuity and disaster recovery plans. And one of the shortcomings that we saw was that, a lot of those plans were a little dusty. And organizations, hadn't looked at them in quite some time. Of those, based on what I've seen from financial institution clients, have been updated. And I would recommend that you go no more than 12 months reviewing those business continuity and disaster recovery plans, because who would have anticipated the pandemic? We never know what's around the corner, and we always want to have those fundamental response plans in place. And another piece beyond talking with the consumer or, how you're going to respond to the consumer, a well thought out response plan also needs to have action steps that need to be taken by your internal stakeholders, right? So make sure the fraud teams, your cyber teams, your marketing and communications teams are all on the same page, that the messaging is clear, concise, makes sense, it's actually going to help, reduce fraud, prevent fraud, and will help to build that customer trust in the financial institution. So, the plan is critical, again, because consumers need to know and trust that even if there is a network intrusion that occurs, even if their data is safe and that nothing was stolen, they just need to know that even if the institution does suffer some kind of security incident or if there is fraud, business has a solid plan in place to mitigate the losses and assist with the fraud resolution, to be there to offer the support.
Tracy, companies, are measured on how well they manage their data breach response, right?
Yes.
And consumers expect it. They expect a good experience around it. Things will happen, but how you rectify and remediate out in the market is super important for the consumers that you serve. And we continue to see data breaches of all sizes across many different verticals. I mean, Brian, I'd be curious to hear your perspective just with the approach with ransomware and the dark web. If you have a point of view on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, no, thanks, Joe. Yeah, so before I hit on that, I love your point, Joe, about your response to a data breach. Obviously, in this space, I've seen various responses, and one thing that I can say that I continue to see some companies continue to get wrong is they wait too long. They try to get everything perfect and all their ducks in line, and too much time passes. And when someone's data is out there, right, for 30, 60 days while you're trying to get that perfect breach response, their identity could be vulnerable. And that often, for the average consumer, they view it that way too, that, you know what, I'd rather you come out early, even if you don't know exactly what happened, like empower me to protect myself. I think that goes a long way with consumers. In regards to ransomware, yeah, it's been the year of ransomware. I mean, obviously between the Colonial Pipeline and JBS, the average ransomware that gets paid out, and this stat is a little old, so I think from about June 2020, was about $230,000. 1 in 3 users who are exposed to an attack like this don't actually fully recover. And this could be an individual or a company. In other words, they don't actually, even if they pay the ransom, they try to recover and they get some of the encryption keys back, they often can't totally recover their entire data set. So organizations hit by ransomware is up about 100% compared to Q1 of 2020. And so this is kind of when I was talking about the organized crime and it's run like a business. This is the kind of the low-hanging fruit and the optimized version of the business right now, where they've got the tools, they've got the techniques, and kind of their cost versus how much profit they get is really, really great with ransomware attacks. And so not only with small businesses, medium businesses, but I think there will be a shift towards hitting consumers directly within the ransomware space in the next 12 to 18 months, rather than just these big corporations. So
now,
definitely need some more education around that.
But I think on the next slide, Tracy, we're going to turn it back over to you.
Sure, yeah. So just kind of going back to what you were saying, Brian, about ransomware attacks, right? So we can talk a lot about educating consumers to help be involved in, reducing fraud, and then institutions playing active roles to help resolve fraud. But what we really need to do is try to prevent any kind of intrusion or fraud in the first place, right? So, it's not just about encrypting data, as you mentioned, it's also about making sure that we secure the perimeter, right? So strengthening perimeter security is a must. Unfortunately, some of the data that we've seen come back recently shows that more institutions, I mean, I was really surprised to see this in financial services, are investing less in perimeter security, and it could just be because they're focusing attention on other things, but that has to be paramount. And the other thing is that, it requires just looking at cybersecurity overall, because it all kind of starts with cybersecurity, right? When we think about the way cyber and fraud fit together, they're definitely cousins, if not siblings, but it starts with good cybersecurity, right? Because you want to prevent anyone from getting in to begin with. And then once somebody actually does get in, or there's data that's exfiltrated, then we've got to move to the fraud prevention piece. But we want to make sure that we focus on cyber. I'd be curious to know if you have thoughts there, Brian.
Yeah, one quick comment, because I'm definitely hearing that there's less focus on kind of the perimeter security. Definitely gives me pause. So still to this day, the 2 primary ways data is exfiltrated out of corporations or consumers is, one, through network security, so your firewalls and your patching processes, and the second is through phishing attacks. People click. People click and their data gets stolen. So those are 2 areas that you really need top of the line, and that should always be a major focus. And you need Class A network security and phishing prevention and education.
Yeah, and one thing on that, Brian, just to ask again, I mentioned that fraud and cyber kind of work hand in hand. But when you're thinking about phishing and anti-phishing training and phishing attacks, would you deem that to be more a function of the cybersecurity team or the fraud team?
I view that as a company culture responsibility. That, yeah, they may buy, your cybersecurity team or your IT team may buy the software, but I think it needs to be something that is really part of your company culture, just like all the other training that you do on repeated basis, often within major corporations. And it needs to be constantly refreshed, because there are new ways of attacking. And this isn't like 10 years ago you'd get the prince from Nigeria, that it was very clear that that is probably not a prince. Nowadays it's very sophisticated. The links look very good, and anyone, especially over the pandemic, you've seen probably a shift to not just email but also text messages. So smishing attack towards more of transportation companies, so things that are branded coming from Amazon or DHL or FedEx. So again, the hackers know where to go based on where the people are and where people are congregating and performing transactions.
Yeah, you're right. I think a lot of what we've talked about today actually needs to go back to culture, right? It's going to cross many different departments, as we talked about earlier. And I mentioned fraud and cybersecurity in tandem with marketing and communications, but HR may play a function there too. So yeah, thanks. So just three, key points that I'd like to make here, Joe, before we move on. And that's fraud reduction or prevention is the best way to retain your customers and members. Your consumer perception of your cybersecurity obviously plays a major role in attrition and retention. And then finally, even if personal information is protected, if your network is accessed in any way, even as we mentioned, PII isn't put out there on the dark web, consumers will consider that to be a breach, and they're more apt to stop doing business with your organization. So, the importance of consumer cybersecurity and fraud prevention empowerment obviously is paramount here. And it drives 22% of consumer satisfaction ratings with online banking. It's something that we found in our online banking practice. So very important for us to look at that.
Now, hey, Brian, Tracy, thanks so much for all the valuable insights and really, how do you turn the insights into action? And for those of you that like to dig much deeper into the research study that we did, at the end of the session here, check your email. You'll see a link where you can download the white paper, which goes in a lot more depth than what we covered on today. If I were to summarize just a couple key takeaways, I think we heard empower your consumers that you serve over and over and over again at almost every stage. Consumers expect it. It's companies' obligations to deliver on that promise. And when you do, and you enhance your fraud controls, and you have a fraud prevention plan, you have a data breach response plan, right? It's going to build the trust that you want from the consumers. It's going to build brand trust. I think the consumers will engage, and they'll have a much better experience in working with the brands that they do trust. And I'll go back to where I started. When consumers engage, businesses improve, and everybody wins. So I want to thank everybody for their time today. This wraps up our session. Hope you all found it very valuable. Again, I mentioned it will be available on demand. And now we have a little bit of time for some Q&A. We've already had a few questions come in on the chat, so I'm going to get started with that. The first one, I think I'm going to go to you, Brian, and then maybe Tracy, you can add some color to it. So where do you see the market over the next 3 years?
So that's a really good question. I think we're at a major pivot point in the market. So specifically in the consumer identity space, we're seeing a consolidation of various services, and for the most part, it's been really focused on monitoring and alerting, right? And that's great. It's been kind of the initial silo into the market, into empowering consumers. But the shift now for the future has to be around prevention and analytics. So I hear this a lot from consumers directly and clients. And so, at Experian, we're heavily focused on this area. We feel like we're at the top when it comes to monitoring and alerting. But next is about how do we get the tools and the capabilities in front of consumers where they can really fully understand their digital footprint, prevent future fraud or identity theft, and provide them with the right analytics so they know that they're making the right choices and the right decisions in their digital behavior.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of add to that. I know we've talked a lot about empowerment, Joe, but I will just say, I mean, I think, in the next 3 years, it's hard to predict, right? Because a lot can change in 3 years, but I do suspect that we will see more consumers demanding empowerment and more institutions and other businesses kind of stepping up to the plate there. I also, will say that we never see fraud go away, like the types of tactics that criminals use. So this uptick that we've seen in scams, especially targeting, some of the digital channels, and like Brian mentioned, kind of the GitHub kind of GitHub economy, like they're going to take advantage of that. We're going to continue to see scams. They aren't going to go away. We're going to continue to see some of the traditional types of attacks that we've always seen, like phishing attacks. Ransomware isn't going to go away, and totally agree with Brian that we will see that transition more to the consumer sector. So institutions need to be thinking about what would they want to include in their security empowerment hub to help consumers there, and investing in some kind of cyber insurance that might give them some protections. And we're not going to see the use of digital channels decline in any way, shape, or form. One thing I also have seen in some of our cybersecurity data, which I think relates to some of the declines that we've seen in investments in, perimeter security, may have related to the misconception of financial institutions and other businesses that once we hit 2021, the workforce would be primarily back in the office. We would not have a predominantly remote workforce, but that's never going away. And so we have to appreciate that reality and know that this is the new normal.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. So the next question that came in, what companies or industries do you think are doing the best job empowering consumers? And Tracy, maybe I'll ask you to lead off on that.
Yeah, sure. So even though we've kind of been pounding here that financial services needs to be doing more to empower consumers, let's be honest, financial services is really doing the best right now, right? Allowing consumers to set up alerts for account balances for transactions. And when I say financial services, I'm talking about, financial institutions as well as credit card companies. I mean, it's kind of across the board. Healthcare is doing a pretty good job too, to be quite honest about it. And I think, again, a lot of this relates to the pandemic because we were relying more heavily on telehealth. And so I've seen where healthcare has kind of gotten much better at encouraging consumers to go into things like MyChart, to go into those secure portals where you can set up text alerts and email alerts and things like that with reminders of appointments, or when you've had some test results that come back in. So I think healthcare is doing pretty well. Retail could probably do a little bit more because I really haven't seen retail adjust in any way, shape, or form, as we've even in e-commerce, because there's much more e-commerce taking place as far as transactions go. So I think, retail could probably learn a little bit from financial institutions and healthcare in that regard.
All right, thanks, Tracy. Brian, would you add anything?
Yeah, I mean, so I do agree with Tracy. I think financial services has done the best, and I think they've had the most to lose for a very long time, right? So I think they have very hardened policies and procedures, and they've hired some of the best security experts. Health is something that I think has struggled just because of the distributed nature of it. And obviously their focus is medicine and making people better. It's not IT and security. But there definitely is a big focus from the dark web kind of threat actors around the health. And they don't care about the MRIs or the X-rays. But when you think about what you present to your doctor, it's a lot of personal information, right? Not just often about yourself, but often about your family. And so that's why it is a very rich target. So that's a gap that I'm hoping to see a lot of the health providers and security services to try to help health providers really fill in over the next 3 years, because they will continue to be a very rich target that's easily exposed.
Yeah,
so I'd like to add something to that on the healthcare piece too, because one thing that we have seen is that even though maybe some of that health information, if it's breached, might not necessarily be of interest, criminals can use that data to put together very targeted phishing attacks, right? So again, making sure that the consumer knows that they're going to be communicating with their healthcare provider through this kind of secure hub is so critical, that they wouldn't be receiving an email, directly necessarily.
Yeah, and this kind of goes, I'm sure, everyone who's gone to the doctor is like, why do I need to fill out all this information? Ask that question sometimes, right? I think this is where, the transition over the next few years of trying to really optimize, and that, as I mentioned earlier, narrowly focus, what do you really need from a consumer to do the best job and do the best service for them? Some of this extra information, all it does is often make you a richer target for hackers.
Mm-hmm.
So Brian, that might lead into this next question. So what tools does Experian have beyond the typical identity and dark web capabilities and offerings?
Yeah, so there's a few things we have right outside the box in terms of we have a lot of educational information from our website. So you can learn about, if you're still fairly new to the dark web, or how does it impact you, what actions you can take. Like, I think one of the frustrations that I've heard from a lot of consumers listening to call center calls is often the advice seems to be repetitive, like go change your password. But my SSN is what was stolen. Why do I go change a password, right? So I think we provide a lot of information there in terms of, based on what part of your digital identity was stolen, here's exactly what you should do. Second, I also do have a blog on LinkedIn that I post some information, just general updates and news. It's also just pretty, it's to plug that for what it's worth. But also, we're really passionate about innovation here. And there's a lot of things that are going to be coming up that I can't go into a lot of detail yet, Joe. But in terms of what I was talking about, prevention and analytics, that we're really excited to hopefully be starting to roll out, in the next 12 to 24 months. That I think will be a game changer to really help people, the layperson, understand what is my actual risk, what has my behavior been, and what should I actually be doing to maybe change some of my behaviors or to take specific actions to really, really reduce my risk footprint.
Yeah, I mean, Brian, where do you think our digital privacy suite now fits in as we roll that out over the next quarter? And I think about providing this kind of security hub and a menu of things that consumers can take advantage of through partners.
Yeah, that's one of the great tools that we're just starting to roll out is our digital privacy suite. There's a VPN capability there. There's a password manager there. Password managers have gotten drastically better. I think a lot of people are like, well, it's just another thing I have to maintain, but we've really consolidated it and put it into kind of one-stop shop. So you can get your credit information, which is a major part of your ongoing risk. You can get your dark web information. You can get some of these tools that are more preventative for the future in terms of making sure you have strong passwords and which ones you should change at the right time, and also things like VPN as you're working from home to make sure your network traffic is properly encrypted.
Thanks for that, Brian. So that's all the time we have for today. If we weren't able to get to your questions, we will follow up offline directly. I hope you found the session valuable. And again, you're able to download it. It's on demand now. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Brian, Tracy, thanks so much for participating today.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Thanks, Joe.
Bye.
All right.